review, like overview of awake craniotomy, neuromonitoring for awake craniotomy, because this topic is going to be covered again by James is giving a presentation, so I'm going to skip that part. So awake surgeries are performed in same manner as conventional craniotomies. The main difference is that patient is awake throughout the surgery. This is a preferred technique for lesions near involving the eloquent tissue in the brain. It allows us to test function before and after and during the resection, and it minimizes the overall risk of all the surgeries. So every time that there's a tumor in the eloquent tissue, motor area, sensor area, especially language area, then we do awake craniotomy. And in awake craniotomy, the dura is the most painful area. So the incision is made and the brain is exposed while patient is intubated, not intubated, sedated. And once we reach the brain, the patient is wakes up, and then we can talk to the patient and get the information. So intraoperative monitoring, multimodality monitoring with sensory and motor mapping as electrocardiography is used for monitoring the central area near the central sulcus. What is the main goal of that? So the main goal of doing the monitoring in awake craniotomy is to preserve the vital brain function, especially motor function and language and motor function, precise localization of sensory, motor, language, and epilepsy area, and maximizing extent of resection while avoiding any new deficit. So awake craniotomies are done for resection of tumor near the language area, near the motor area, and for epilepsy surgery, and also for deep brain stimulation, implanting the implant for deep brain stimulation. Protective neuromonitoring for identification of neural function. Again, we also use neuromonitoring for therapeutic mapping for epilepsy surgeries, and also therapeutic mapping for placement of grid for pain relief, and deep brain stimulation for treatment of Parkinson, dystonia, essential tremor, epilepsy, OCD. All these are FDA approved. So intraoperative monitoring during awake neurosurgery provide a real-time feedback, identification of the sensory, motor, language area, and subcortical area. There are different types of brain tumors, and the tumors, it depends what is the origin of the tumor. So the tumors are originating from meninges, they are known as meningiomas. The primary tumor, they arise from the normal brain tissues, and they are called glial cells, they are known as glioma. The tumors, they are secondary or they are metastatic tumor. They can arise from any other place, and they are metastasized in the brain, and most often from lungs, breast tumors, abdominal, and skin cancer and bone cancer. So the origin of the cell, glial cell, is glioma. From astrocyte is astrocytoma, oligodendrocyte, oligodendroglioma. Ependymal cell is ependymoma. Neurons, ganglioglioma and ganglioneuroma. From pineal cells is pineocytoma, pineoblastoma. Reticuloendothelial cells, primary cerebral lymphoma, and the vascular cells gives hemangioblastoma. So all the names of the tumors. So when you walk in and taking the history, just looking at if it's glioma, that means it's the origin is glioma. It's the primary tumors arising from the glial cell. If a patient has ependymoma, it's starting from ependymal cell. So electrical stimulation of the cortex was 1874. So the stimulation of the human originate from the invention of electricity. So when electricity was created, somebody touched and got shocked, and that was stimulation. That was first neuromonitoring experience. So the neuromonitoring has back dated like 200 years. So there was, I don't have the name, there's another author, so he published data in 1866 that if you stimulate a brain of a person, brain of a monkey, it moves their hand on the other side. That was 1866. So he got hold of like a monkey with the exposed brain due to some rig, and he started stimulating. And there's another study in 1800s, late 1890s, stimulation of the brain of humans and getting some responses, but that patient died after that. So, but recently, the Ojem, the Penfield is one of the famous neurosurgeons. So in 1959, he published paper in almost, I think, 300 patients by language mapping, stimulating the brain and identifying all the language area. Ojeman published initial paper in late, and then 89, identifying the cortex essential to the language. So the awake craniotomy is done for epilepsy surgery, tumor, atriovenous malformation, movement disorders, and other cases. So sensory mapping, the different techniques, sensory mapping. James is going to talk about the technical side. So we do phase reversal to identify the central sulcus. So if the tumor is somewhere here, most of the time if there's no neuromonitoring and you're not doing mapping, you look at the surgeon look at the other side and say, okay, where is the central sulcus? If the central sulcus is here on the left side, it should be here on the right side, but which is not always true, because you can look at the MRI, and when you open when you do craniotomy, you look at the surgeon is looking at the brain, and on the brain. So I'll just give you an example. And I went to surgery, and I asked surgeon, okay, this is a tumor. Where are you going to go? So okay, the tumor is in the primary motor area. I'm going to go to gyrus anterior, and I'm going to avoid motor area, premotor area, and do a resection. I said, okay, let's do mapping. So when you did mapping, the surface area was same. The primary central sulcus, precentral gyrus, they were at the same position, but the functional area, it moves to gyrus anterior. So without monitoring, he would have gone straight through the primary motor area. So I said, okay, I'm glad I did have a mapping. But so the functional area, so the anatomical area can be same or different, but the functional area can be different. The tumors can push, this tumor can push them, we don't know, is pushing without functional testing, we don't know this tumor is pushing the motor area anterior or posterior or medial or lateral. So that can only be done by mapping of the brain. And then we have sensory mapping and motor mapping. The sensory mapping is done to identify the central sulcus and the sensory area of the brain. Once we identify the central sulcus and sensory area, we can stimulate the motor area and identify the motor area. How we do that? So we put the grid on the brain and then stimulate the contralateral median nerve, and we get a phase reversal. But this is a 1/8 grid, so we have 1/8 grid, and you can see this. This is the premotor response. Premotor response is down and up, and postcentral is N20 is up and down. So you have phase reversal between 1 and 2. So 2 is the closest to central sulcus, 3 is farther, and 4th is the farther. So this is the central sulcus. The problem with the single grid is that you think that central sulcus is a straight line, which is never a straight line, it's a curved line. So the better to do is 2/4 grid, or have a bigger grid so you can see how it goes. And this response you can see on regular SSCP. If you are not measuring the head, again, we did the exercise yesterday, you put the electrode 1 centimeter anterior to the central sulcus, you're going to get down and up peak. And we have, we should send that pictures to everyone. We have cases where the person was monitoring, have the phase reversal in regular SSCP, but they were marking this response as N20 and this response as P30 instead of this 20 and 30. And if you're monitoring this is N20, this is not N20, this is N18, which is coming from thalamic response. We have P16 and N18. So if the patient has stroke in thalamocortical radiation or in cortex, you're not going to pick up anything because you are monitoring the wrong peak. So if you look at the stack, you'll see the changes, but if you're not looking at stack, you'll not see the changes. Again, another, so you have a phase reversal here between 1 and 2, precentral down and up and down. We wrote a paper from UVA in 2011 about a P25 response. So this is an extra response which is produced only on the somatosensory gyrus in hand area. So if you get a P25 response, that grid is right on the hand area, because you can put the grid any place on the central sulcus and you'll get a phase reversal. It doesn't mean you're on the hand area. So because when you stimulate a median nerve, the signal is produced in a specific area in the brain, and the central sulcus is very long, 5-6 centimeter. You put the grid on any place on central sulcus, you'll get a phase reversal. But when the grid is close to that hand area, you'll see the P25. And that's a radial response, because 20 and 30 is tangent and P25 is radial to that. So this is a picture from that paper. We have 2/4 grid. You have grid number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And you see you have pre-central response, pre-central with P25, and then post-central, which look like pre-central, but it's post-central because it's more deflection downward than upward. And this is N18 response, it's a thalamic response. And then have, so phase reversal between 2 and 3, and then 7 and 8. So grid is going sulcus. But if you have only 1/4 grid, you will make a straight line. And on this grid, you can see the phase reversal, the central sulcus is curved. So once you have that, so many times, like even when you're communicating with the neurosurgeons, you tell them, okay, this is pre-central, this is motor responses, and we always get understood because they think that this is a motor response. So this is not a motor response. You can take a brain out, motor area out, gyrus, you'll still get these responses because these responses are originating from the post-central gyrus, but they are picked up by a grid on the pre-central area. So the responses are produced in the post-central area, but are picked by, these are recorded on the pre-central area. So in order to confirm the motor area, we have to stimulate the motor area. And there are two different types of methods. One is fast stimulation, one is slow frequency, high frequency and low frequency. The old Penfield method is slow frequency 50 Hertz stimulation for 3-4 seconds, but it has a very high risk of having seizures. And now the new one, Taniguchi method, is high frequency. So the Penfield method is 200-400 pulse width microsecond, stimulating at 50 Hertz for 2 to 3 seconds up to 4 seconds, and looking for responses. You can go up to, start from 2 milliampere and maximum is 20 milliampere. Or if you see after discharges, if the patient starts seizing. If patient starts seizing at 12 or 10 to 18 or 15, you stop there. If you don't, it doesn't seize, then you can go up to 20 milliampere, this maximum. So if you're stimulating with the Penfield, you see a response, because this is a response at 4.3 milliampere, very short train. This is stimulation artifact in electrocardiography. The grid is EEG recording from the brain, and this is spontaneous EMG. You see multiple responses because we are doing 50 Hertz stimulation. There are 50 stimulation for 200, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. That means there are 200 pulses. And if you look at this, is 10 milliseconds per division. So the time between each response is 20 milliseconds, which is same as frequency. Frequency of 50 Hertz is 20 millisecond ISI. That's the filter setting for electrocardiography. Another one, so you have spontaneous EMG, triggered EMG, and then electrocardiography. You can see the stimulation artifact for 1.5-2 seconds. As followed, patient has after discharges, you can getting more and more. You can see when you see the patient after discharges, so you have to make sure you don't stimulate between them until it disappears. And we inform the surgeon and circulator immediately, and they need to have a slush machine, which is ice saline, not the regular saline. And ice saline is a slush machine, so you pour the normal sodium chloride and it make it slushy. If you put it, and when you apply that to brain directly, it inhibits the spread of seizures to the other area. So if the area is spread beyond that, then that's application of ice saline is not going to work because it's not localized to that stimulation site anymore. So you have to do very, very quickly. Once it's spread to the other hemisphere or the more area hemisphere, then you have to do intravenous propofol bolus, or sometimes they give muscle relaxant, which is not good, but propofol, and then you cannot do monitoring because patient is totally burst suppression and have total deep anesthesia. We do spontaneous EMG from all the contralateral muscles, upper extremity, lower extremity. Going to the language area, there are two language areas, Broca's and Wernicke's. So Broca's area is more anterior, is more close to the motor area, Wernicke's is more posterior. Broca's areas have 3 sub-areas. So when we do language mapping, so we go and talk to the patient in preoperative area. We monitor, we take a baseline with this patient because a patient cannot do something as has a deficiency in one thing we cannot test in the OR. So you have to make sure those items are not included in the testing. So we get the baseline. For example, we show them a picture, and if the patient cannot identify a picture of car, ball, motorcycle, something, we don't use that in the OR. So we take out those pictures from our from set. So pars apicularis, Broca's area, pars triangularis is a more triangular shape. Then have prefrontal cortex and pars orbitalis. Wernicke's has posterior superior temporal area, or PSTG, and angulus gyrus and supramarginal. And then the other language area are basilar temporal language area, arcuate fibers, and superior aspect of it. The arcuate fibers are the fibers, they connect the two Broca's and connecting. So if you are able to identify Broca's and Wernicke and have no damage, but these fibers, they are connected, they are damaged, then patient will not be able to have language deficiency. So we not only have to identify the Broca's and Wernicke, we have to identify the arcuate fibers, which are connecting fibers between those two areas. And they are arcuate fibers, they connect between the auditory area to this area and the visual area to this area. So for Broca's, again, inferior frontal gyrus is more inferior. So you see this one, the first one, most posterior one is opercle, pars opercularis. The triangular shape is pars triangularis, and the most anterior one is orbital part. Any damage caused to this area will have aphasia. Aphasia means patient will not be able to speak because your central sulcus here is anterior to that. There's a motor area, and that's responsible for speech. So and all these areas. So patient, if the damage is in Broca's area, patient will not be able to talk. Wernicke's area is posterior, and if that is damaged, it will result in impaired speech comprehension. Patient will be fluent but paraphasic speech. So you'll not be able, patient will be keep talking, but it will be all junk, so you have no idea. And patient will think that he's talking and you're not understanding. From patient side, he or she think that that person is talking normally, but you don't understand what they're saying. So these are the fibers, again, arcuate fibers. So when you're stimulating, so they have essential areas are identified by cortical stimulation, and they are indispensable for function, so we cannot resect on that. Any deficit will result in injury. The involved area, they are identified by multiple tests like MER, functional MRI. Involved in cortex can be resected. No postoperative deficit, so there are no postoperative deficit if you're doing resection there. The plan, when we walk into that, that's our plan. We do preoperative language evaluation. We look for deficit, patient has any deficit or have no deficit. Intraoperatively, we take the same test. We do intraoperative mapping, we do cortical sensory mapping. James is going to talk about more that, how we do that, and then cortical motor mapping, and then we do cortical language mapping. So these are the different, every area has a different test. So yeah, you can take a printout or try to, we do again and again, and then you memorize. So for pars opercularis, which is the most distal, the function is classic speech production. And any deficit in that will cause complete speech arrest or hesitation or stumbling during production. So it's not always complete speech arrest. Sometimes patient is stuttering or patient have hesitation to start, so that could be part of that. I did one patient, so I went to the OR, and she was 65-year-old lady, and she had a tumor in Broca's area and was resected. But so when I showed her picture of Rain, actually Rain and Combe, so she was trying to tell me by signs and everything, but she couldn't remember that. So I said Rain, she said yes, Rain. The word was in the memory, but she couldn't recall. So I showed her brush, she was trying to brush her hair and show everything. I thought I was on a reality show or something, but I couldn't. Then I said brush, she said yes, brush, okay. So my time was up. So that was, so how we test that, we ask the patient to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They can count 1 to 10, 20, call alphabet. I ask them to read alphabet. Days of the week, month of the week. So we do different, they are all speech related, but we alternate, so we are not just doing on one testing. Month of the year, preposition and object naming, you show them the cards and picture. So those are the, if that opercularis is damaged, so you can either have a classic speech arrest, you can have failure to produce words. It can also raise hesitation and slurring also. The second one in the middle, pars triangularis, the function is associated with classic speech production, and any deficit in this one will have aphasia or loss of difficulty with production and category of the words. So again, the same test, object naming, counting, days of the week, so we use that one. Pars orbitalis, which is most anterior, the function is associated with word production and development. Often the function is specific to nouns, words, and subcategory of nouns. So this area is more specific to nouns and verbs. So if you ask them to test them, you ask them, okay, what are the favorite topics, pizza toppings? Okay, cheese, pepperoni, chicken, grill, whatever. So those are, and then we make sure we name that. So if you tell them the top, the different pizza topping and ask them to repeat that or show the picture and identify them. And also different nouns like showing the pictures and identification. Ask to repeat the words, asking them to repeating sentences, noun production and verb production. The car is driven by, the plane is flown by, so fill in the blank, so they have action word in that too. And if that area is specific area is damaged, patient will have little paraphysic errors, verbal. So even patient will not be able to write in the writing. They have paraphysic errors. They have verbal paraphysic errors. They have nonsense words, slurring, hesitation, and arrest may occur in that area. And then you have STGs or superior temporal gyrus is again responsible for classic auditory language comprehension with primary input from auditory module. So this area has input from auditory area. So if you tell them to the sentence completion, you ask them to complete a sentence or ask them to repeat the phrase or ask them to tell them the name of the object, ask them to repeat, they will not be able to do that because that auditory. But if you show them, they will be able to identify because when they look at the picture, they have a feedback from the visual area. So this is the feedback from the auditory area. So the auditory area, it's all about listening and repeating. And when patient, if the patient has damage to that, or patient have a surgery done, or because of the tumor, patient will say, okay, could you repeat that? Patient will say, I didn't understand what you're saying, or they will select a wrong word. Wernicke's area, they have angular gyrus, and that's it gets visual input related to language, so it has an input from the visual area. STG has visual input from the auditory area. Angular gyrus has input from the visual area. So if this is damaged, it will based on the deficit. So, and again, patient will saying it's hard to see. I cannot see the words. There's something wrong with the words, or they will have a kind of aphasia, paraphasia, or hesitation to say that. But that hesitation will not be due to Broca's deficit because of Wernicke's, because they cannot identify the structure through the naming. So for the angular, so for the visual area, so even it's very interesting. But when the kid is born, a child is born, whatever picture they first see, is implanted in the brain, and everything else they see, they refer that to that picture. This is mother, or first person they see the mother, and they see the father, they say, okay, this is not mother, this is father, this is not mother, this is brothers. So everyone is reference to that. If you take out that part of the brain, it's a less than micrometer, they cannot identify any other person. But when you talk to them, they will identify you because that identification, imprint identification is on the visual area. But their auditory feedback is intact, so they can identify the sound auditory feedback, but they will never be identified. Again, inferior temporal gyrus, object naming, and any damage to that will object naming failure. So they'll not be able to. Arcuate fibers, again, they are all the fiber, they're connecting all these area together. So the main point is to identify the Broca's area and the three part of the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area and STG and angular gyrus in that area, and then follow the fibers that are connected to each other. So neuromonitoring is the key. Again, awake crania, we don't have a problem with the muscle relaxant or a gas agent because patients are awake. So those are very good cases to do motor mapping. Sensory mapping is difficult because patient is awake and you start stimulating, patients start feel pain. So sensory mapping we always do before they wake up the patient. So we do phase reversal, and then when the patient is awake, then you are good to go with the motor mapping. So typical, we have asleep, awake, asleep. They do propofol infusion, Remi, and laryngeal mask anesthesia, LMA. Anesthesia given by mask, local anesthesia for Mayfield pains, and for dura, opening dura, again dura is the most painful area. So again, awake, sleep, awake. So when the patient is awake, this is nothing except for anticonvulsant. When the patient is asleep, is on the propofol bolus, Dex can be given, narcotics and anticonvulsants, and when the patient is awake, nothing except for anticonvulsant. So you have to make sure the patient has the bolus of anti-epileptic before the incision or as soon as possible. Even the patient is on anti-epileptic, because if even the patient, most of the patient, they come with a history of seizures or 1 or 2 episodes of seizures. That's why they got diagnosed. But if even they don't have history of seizure, the patient is awake, the threshold is lower. So when we stimulate with 10, 20 milliampere directly, that can, and that's the best place and worst place to have a seizure. Because best place because you have all the drugs available, but worst place, patient head is in pins and you can break the neck or something. Surgical positioning, so most of the time, 80-90% patients, they have a language area on the left side, so left side is up, they have the marking. Once the craniotomy done, the grid dura is open, we do sensory mapping, we do motor mapping, electrography, we check impedance, wake up the patient. So we do all these things. So I'm not going to go in detail because James is going to talk about that. So, but for the language part, once the patient is awake, before you start resecting, you start talking to the patient. If the tumor is in the Broca's area, we try to find pars apicularis, triangularis, and all 3 areas, orbitalis, so we monitor that. If the patient is in Wernicke's area, we do pictures, card, naming, auditory, visual testing. And then we start resecting, and when we're doing resecting, so all the tasks, so we are doing continuously. Either somebody is talking to the patient, so you cannot do alone, so you need to have like 2 people, because one person is talking to the patient and one person is doing the stimulation. So just a sample of different pictures. You can take a picture card from different. So when you identify this area, so the surgeon, they are putting the sticker on that. So and what we do is we make a list of that. 2 is, if you're doing it's a motor mapping, then we say okay, 2 is hand, 3 is foot, 1 is face, whatever. Or if it's a language mapping or motor mapping, if it's a language map, and then say okay, 2 or 1, 2, 3 stickers that patient has aphasia and this one patient has hesitation in this area. For the stimulation part, so this is one of the patient we did. So this is a 8 by 8 grid. This was, and so this was sensory area. These and this was epilepsy surgery. So it was implanted and then we came back. So this was sensory, this was motor, and these 2 dark blue points were the epilepsy force. So the surgeon he took out only that area, and that neurosurgeon tells me that okay, he's the only neurosurgeon, he does the plastic surgery because he went through the grid and resected. Microelectrode recording for deep brain stimulation. So again, they are all awake patient with the history of Parkinson, dystonia, epilepsy. You have to target the area. If it's a Parkinson, you do subthalamic nucleus. If patient has dystonia or essential tremor, you go to VIM, different nucleus, and do a single cell recording. And once we have in the same area, we take the recording out and put the stimulator there and leave that there. So the DBS target frame and recording from. So for language area or even for motor mapping, so the reference point is every milliampere is equal to 1 millimeter. If you're getting response at 5 milliampere, that means you are 5 millimeter from that corticospinal tract. If you are doing language mapping, if you are 5 millimeter from speech arrest, you're getting speech arrest at 4 milliampere. That means you are at 4 millimeter from that language area. So yeah, it's directly correlates with each other. That's this is the second highest lake in the world. The height of the lake is 12,500 feet from sea level, and it's 3-hour hike. So I've been there like 5 times. So I love that.